So, good evening, everybody. I'm just going to check my mic here briefly and make sure I turn my audio back up to my previous setting. So, that should be helpful. There we go. All right. And it looks like we're Facebook Live. So, here we are. It's Monday. We have another week of cannabis assisted recovery. That is the kind of recovery I identify with. So, part of what I look to do, every week is to, give people a space to talk about being a cannabis patient in recovery, and to think about the different recovery literature and information that's out there, and to share my experience with those, which might be a little bit different than some of the other folks. I want to encourage people to be open-minded and to challenge people to try to think differently, um, and to look at kind of the collective of what's been done, and to really try to take in as much as you can. Really don't try to rule things out till you learn about them. I've tried to kind of get in and get my hands on and really get to understand what a lot of folks out there have come to believe in recovery and the various literatures. I've spent a lot of time reading and in study with them. Not just 12-step literature. I feel is a good place to start because a lot of people are talking about 12-step. A lot of people are familiar with 12-step. There's a lot of information. There's people kind of in two camps, and very much so, people that very much believe in the 12-step philosophy and ideology, and the people that believe that that philosophy and ideology has a lot of potential for harm, and so there's two very polarized camps of people, and I've spent quite a bit of time during this past week. Snickers, I love you, but he wants to be in every video. I swear, he's so cute. So I've been spending a lot of my time this week trying to mediate conflicts between these two groups, and I just want to put it out there that, like, we have really big problems, like, as a community, both as people who have lived experience with using drugs or substances, or anything in that entire grouping. I would even be as bold as to include the people who are drinking, even the people who are smoking cigarettes. All of us that have dealt with some kind of stigma around the products we choose to consume, which is really what it comes down to, is just a preference choice. Um, so we wind up in this position where we're divided because of the conflict. And I'm like, please, guys, not right now. Like, just put your axes to grind with each other down for a little bit until we can sort out the things that we can agree on, because there's a lot of things that we can agree on that need work. There's a lot of things that we can agree on that need work. And so we don't have to focus on where the conflicts are in order for us to come together and get things done, and really keep our eye on the big prize of things that are really driving a lot of our societal issues, which have nothing to do with what AA is doing, and have nothing to do with what the treatment community is or isn't doing, but more to do with, like, the people that have power over all of that are doing to actively contribute to the problem. And that effort continues, and it continues to grow. And until we can stop fighting each other, like, we're not going to get anywhere, establish enough power amongst ourselves to deal with that. And I think it's really important that we focus on that. There's a much bigger piece here. So I've been promising you guys for weeks that I would walk you through what is called the doctor's opinion and the diagnosis. One of the things that I want to encourage people about this tool, and I just want to put this out there because it's just been so hot in our conversation lately, that, if you do not feel that you are ready for an abstinence-based recovery, do not feel pressured, do not feel forced. The majority of successful recoveries out there today are still self-initiated, moderation-based forms of recovery. People choose to use less, and they move from problematic use into what we call remission, and they move away from problematic use, and that is a positive outcome. That's a very positive outcome. So I want to encourage people to just, if you've struggled with abstinence or the community of abstinence, I respect their beliefs, but my beliefs are very much in alignment with what we observe across people, and I support what the majority do, which is just simple moderation and cutting down, and that is proven to be the most common form of recovery. And so the abstinence ideology, while it's very puritanical and it's you know uh, strict self-denial adherence, that it's not the only way. And it's not the only way that we can use this literature, right? So, like, when you walk through the steps, it's so bizarre because, depending on who you talk to or who you encounter as a sponsor, everybody has a different way of interpreting this literature. So, as somebody who's lived in multiple states and gone to many places and seen lots of different 12-step recovery groups, they're not all doing the same thing. They're kind of doing the same thing, but they're not all doing the same thing. So it's already present within the community, even if it's not aware that it's present at to the degree that it is. But it just simply is. It was interesting because when I first encountered the AANA, I had already been in the cannabis program for many years. So to me, it was as natural as a medicine as taking my medicine for my lipids to control my cholesterol. So it was just a part of my routine. I didn't really think much of it. And so I was just going to meetings, and I never even questioned the fact of whether or not I was in recovery, because I wasn't fucking snorting pills, and I wasn't snorting lines of coke, and I wasn't drinking until I black out. And so, like, that to me was recovery. Like, there were some really dangerous things I was doing. And I stopped doing those things, many of those things. In fact, I even consider quitting cigarettes to be a part of that effort. And people don't. It's not even mind altering. It doesn't really do anything for you except give you cancer, and I consider that. So my idea of recovery itself is a little different. The way that the SAMHSA definition, I believe they really articulated well. Is just being able to make choices and live a lifestyle that promotes like positive global health. And I think that's important, that we recognize that it's as simple as that, making better choices. And even if they're small choices or they're big choices, it's just a focus on positivity. And I think a lot of what the people that wrote these books, they intended well. And so I don't think that there was an active malicious intent behind people sharing their stories and sharing their experiences with other people, and trying to help other people that didn't have hope to find hope. And I think that that's a really important thing for people, whether or not they believe in 12-step philosophy or program literature, is that we should, believe in hope. Hope, then you can feel like you can be inspired to change. And they found in other study, I was reading a paper by William White, and he writes about these young women in Chicago, and they had a program. And they said that when they approached these women and they began to try to apply this program, and they looked at it more objectively, they were realizing that the assumption that somebody was going to hit a rock bottom, and then in a desperate cry of grief and desperation, somehow admit to being powerless and then initiate recovery. But the problem was these young women, unfortunately, had a seemingly fathomless capacity for hitting a further bottom, and experiencing more and more and more pain, and more trauma, and things just continued to spiral out of control. But when they sent compassionate people in who just were very patient with these young women and allowed them to express themselves and didn't get very reactive very quickly and were generally very supportive. And what it did is this patient and compassionate supportive approach, just being there, being consistent, being reliable, it helped some of these women to start to find hope. And as they started to find hope, that somebody believed in them and somebody was there for them and they weren't just going to abandon them because of what they were doing. And, there were all these like negative belief systems that had become entrenched in these individuals. And it would self-validate. It was reinforced through routine. And so these patterns where they had used this to protect themselves from people became maladaptive to some extent. And so the way to break that was to just continue to just be present and be with that person in the moment. And I talk about being a harm reductionist, and when I talk about harm reduction, it's a philosophy of like everything that I do. I frame it, from uh, a very fundamental understanding of, does this reduce harm? I think about all my interactions with people that I'm trying to help through that lens. And so that's how I apply it. And so let me get into reading some of this, and that way we can start to talk about what it is that these people describe, because they describe a very specific thing. And I want to say that because people are all different, it's not going to apply to everybody the same, and that's just a given for people. There was never a one size fit all descriptor for people. This does tend to very accurately describe a grouping of characteristics. And I think that that grouping of characteristics helps people to establish a common definition of what something is. And so what they were trying to do is to establish a coherent definition of what is an alcoholic for somebody to self qualify, for them to understand, like, I live with this condition, so, now I should consider doing this. And then they laid out a set of recommendations for that person. But I think it's important to understand, if we look at this objectively, I don't think that they were pretty far off the mark when it came to the diagnosis, especially considering that this is a doctor's opinion. This wasn't, this is a letter from a doctor talking about the alcoholic condition. I think what this doctor says, well, this is very dated, was way, way, way ahead of its time. This guy really, really understood from his own practice experience, and I've heard this from professionals over and over again. That we need to be able to also trust our practice experience, on top of being, in addition to, I wouldn't say in spite of, or but in addition to trying to adhere to being evidence based, but we should also trust our practice experience. And so this gentleman does a very fine job of laying out a very specific type of alcoholic. Um, and I think it helps people to understand what they're dealing with, and that other people have dealt with similar things. Now, if they're not similar, that's okay too. That just means that you may not identify this way. So it doesn't mean that you have to meet this definition. It's just a definition, and like most definitions, I mean, we use the word art, but nobody can ever, it's like one of the most hotly debated philosophical topics. What is the epistemology of art? What does art mean? What is a how does something qualify as art? Right. So we use words like that all the time. We don't like rip them apart for the fact that we use them, like we do with this. So let's get into it. I should be able to read through it pretty quick. So it starts at the doctor's opinion, and it says, we of Alcoholics Anonymous believe that the reader will be interested in the medical estimate of the plan of recovery described in this book. So convincing testimony must surely come from medical men who have had experience with the sufferings of our members and have witnessed our return to health. A well-known doctor, a chief physician at a nationally prominent hospital specializing in alcoholic and drug addiction, gave Alcoholics Anonymous this letter. And so, to whom it may concern, in the treatment of alcoholism for many years, um, excuse me. I forgot to silence my phone. How rude of me. There we go. Hopefully that didn't kill the feed volume. I haven't tested those waters yet. There we go. All right. So I have specialized in the treatment of alcoholism for many years. In late 1934, I attended a patient who, though he had been a competent businessman of good earning capacity, was an alcoholic of a type I had come to regard as hopeless. In the course of this third treatment, he acquired certain ideas concerning a possible means of recovery. As part of his rehabilitation, he commenced to present his conceptions to other alcoholics, impressing upon them that they must do likewise with still others. This has become the basis of a rapidly growing fellowship of these men and their families. This man and over 100 others appeared to have recovered. So far, very not specific. So he goes on to say, I personally know scores of cases who were of the type with whom other methods had failed completely. Oh, so he's addressing that he knows of a person that had tried this other possible means of recovery. Okay, so he's acknowledging that he's familiar, at least, with the presence of the Alcoholics Anonymous. So these facts appear to be of extreme medical importance because of the extraordinary possibility of rapid growth inherent in this group, that they may mark a new epoch in the annals of alcoholism. These men may well have a remedy for thousands of such situations. So he's writing an endorsement. I don't really care what that physician's saying. So the physician who, at our request, gave us this letter has been kind enough to enlarge upon his views in another statement which follows. In this statement, he confirms what we who have suffered alcoholic torture must believe. And I'll point out that these guys wrote specifically about alcoholism, so I don't know whoever came up with NA. I'm not as familiar with the history of NA. But this book was written very specifically for people who drink alcohol. And I don't believe that all addictions are the same. I don't even believe that all alcohol addictions are the same. So, just so we're all on the same page. So, in the statement, he confirms that we who have suffered the body of an alcoholic is quite as abnormal as his mind. It did not satisfy us to be told that we could not control our drinking just because we were maladjusted to life, that we were in full flight from reality, or were outright mental defectives. These things were true to some extent, in fact, to a considerable extent for some of us, but we were sure that our bodies were sickened as well. In our belief, our picture of the alcoholic, which leaves out his physical factors, incomplete. Um, and I think that it's important to note that at this time, with the limited understanding in human biology, there wasn't a whole lot of science. They were just starting to understand, like, there was a difference between, like, mental and physical health, and they were so far off the mark with brain health for so long that it's hard to even wrap your head around the fact that they came somewhat close to the ideas. So I respect when people criticize, like, some of the validity of the literature, because there is a very dated element here, and it hasn't been updated. This book has not been updated in a very long time, longer than I've been in recovery. So, so a doctor's theory was that they have an allergy to alcohol, and as laymen, I guess uh, the opinion that they have, of course, their opinion doesn't mean much. But as former problem drinkers, I guess they say that the explanation makes sense. So they agree with the doctor. It does explain a lot of things, which these guys who were not educated people who wrote this book, not educated in biology at least, um, that for which they couldn't otherwise account. So it made sense that it was a reasonable suggestion. Not finding anything particularly radical in what this says, but I don't see why people get so worked up about it. Um, so, though we work out a solution on the spiritual as well as the altruistic plane, so we're talking about the concept of holistic. Some people believe that the best treatment of the human body is they call holistic, so mental, physical, spiritual, and the three are present. So they actually capture some of these ideas very early in our history. Um, so it's interesting. So people can agree or disagree with the spirituality of it. I think that's less instrumental, especially, they do rate to agnostics and say you don't really have to believe in much beyond something other than you, which I find beliefs to be pretty helpful. People feel they have a purpose, it tends to have better outcomes. Um, that's just in general. It's not even AA philosophy. It's just life. It's the way it works. Life. So even though we might work out that solution, we favor hospitalization for the alcoholic who is very jittery or befogged. So they also say here directly that they don't they don't recommend using this right away. But if somebody is like actively struggling with their alcohol and they're having physical dependence, they're even saying like you should go to the hospital, not do this. So like the book says it. So I don't know why there's confusion about that, but the courts have their own idea of what they think people should do, but this book doesn't agree with the court. If a person needs medical attention, they don't need this. They need medical attention. Um, so more often than not, it's imperative that a person's brain be cleared before they're even approached about trying to do this. So they got to already be well in the clear before talking to them about doing something like this. And the reason for that is because the work that you can do using some of the tools in this book on yourself, which are also very strongly supported by certain clinical interventions in CBT, are actually helpful, but they're advanced. They're not like early recovery tools. But they're just not. And for me, recovery starts long before abstinence. It starts back when you first decide you're going to switch from liquor to beer, or you know what I mean. Like that to me is where recovery starts. But um, so the doctor writes, right? The subject presented in this book seems to me to be of paramount importance to those who are afflicted with the alcohol condition. So he's really excited to help these people. He says, I say that after many years of experience as a medical director of one of the oldest hospitals in the country treating alcohol and drug addiction, there was therefore a sense of real satisfaction when I was asked to contribute a few words on the subject, which is covered in incredible detail in these pages. We doctors have realized for a long time that some form of moral psychology was of urgent importance to alcoholics, but its application presented difficulties beyond our conception. With our ultra-modern standards, our scientific approach to everything, we are perhaps not well equipped to apply the powers of good that lie outside our synthetic knowledge. Pretty prudent observation, given that we now understand their understanding was very primitive. It's almost ironic. I can appreciate his honesty. Um, so many years ago, one of the leading contributors to this book came under their care, and while here he acquired some ideas, which he put into practical application at once. Later, he requested the privilege of being allowed to tell his story to other patients at the hospital. And with some misgiving, they consented. So the cases they have followed through have been most interesting. In fact, many of them are amazing. The unselfishness of the men, and they were all men, as we have come to know them, the entire absence of profit motive and their community spirit is indeed inspiring to one who has labored long and wearily in the alcoholic field. They believe in themselves and still more in the power that pulls chronic alcoholics back from the gates of death. Very interesting. So there are some important elements to note because reading a doctor's account makes me think, what is happening here that we know leads to better recoveries. Not even just for people in 12 steps, but just people in general, whether it's recovery from injury or illness or, right? And so, being actively involved and engaged in a community of people, that, that alone leads to better and stronger outcomes. People have um, greater performance in groups, generally speaking. Um, and it would improve people's societal perception of the group by engaging actively in the community and service. And we also know that narrative, like particularly the repetitious, like telling of a narrative, does really incredible things to help people who have survived trauma and to process that trauma and to de-escalate some of the symptoms that could be very triggering for a person who's trying to figure out how to navigate abstinence. Um, and I think that's important to note too, that narrative is not a radical or controversial concept in terms of its therapeutic benefits. Um, so again, I think there's a lot of things to unpack from this that it spread a lot of common understanding of certain types of interventions that people benefit from, right? Whether or not it's in the context of doing it in a 12-step program. So I want to unpack those things too as we come through them. So of course, an alcoholic ought to be freed from the physical craving for liquor, and that often requires a definite hospital procedure. So again, reinforcing that, the importance of the medical community in helping people through those physiological changes. Detoxification is an incredibly dangerous process, and it's not encouraged for people to go through it just on their own if they've been, drinking for a long time, or in the case of many other drugs, certainly very, very important to seek medical support when you're first trying to enter a period of abstinence, if that's what's right for you. Um, Even if you're, unfortunately, if you're a cannabis patient, they don't have any detox facilities that you can receive medical supervision and continue to access your medication. So we have some work to do in advocacy to make that a reality, because that's a terrifying reality for those of us who are in the program who, are concerned that there may be a recurrence because it's so common for us, that really there isn't anywhere to go, and perhaps other people who have been in been in the cannabis program, can relate to that experience and can share some of their challenges around navigating access to treatment barriers. I would love to hear about other people's experiences with that. Um, so he goes on to talk about, I'm going to start paraphrasing because I'm running down to 25 minutes. So he talks about, and this is really the first place where they get into some of the specific symptoms, but so the phenomenon of craving, and this is one of the first ones that pops up. Uh, and so they said that, we believe, and so suggested a few years ago, that the action of alcohol on these chronic alcoholics, so they're describing a specific kind of a person's biology in response, is a manifestation of an allergy. So they're equating it to an allergy. And that in these individuals with this allergy, there's a psychological phenomenon called a craving, and that it is limited to this class to experience these particular cravings that never occur in the average temperate drinker. And I don't know what it's like to be a non alcoholic, but I can definitely share with you, come on, Snickers, what it's like to be an alcoholic and experience that because I was um I was facing a lot of time in prison. Snickers, your butt on the video is not welcome. Let's not do that. So when I first experienced um, that particular um, it's like a mental block. It's a really hard thing to describe because I had like 20 years or so. I think it was I think it was down to about 15 years on my sentence, and I was on community release, and I had a triggering incident where I had experienced a traumatic event. I had found my girlfriend dead, and it really put me in a place of vulnerability, and I was open to suggestion. I was injured and emotionally destroyed at like all at the same time, and so at the moment when I started drinking again, I had no defense to what occurred, to what happened after, and even when it got into the hands of the court and it became a problem that was bringing me back into court, that I even had gone to a hospitalization program and I would spend like 8 hours at this place all day, and I couldn't tell you how I ended up at the package store. I couldn't tell you why I went to the package store. I genuinely barely even remember at times even remembering to make a decision to get into my car and drive to the package store. I was completely and utterly not self-aware of those things, and it took a long time for those things to stop. Um, and a big part of that was my brain operating on a primitive level faster and more powerfully than my brain was on a cognitive level. So it was like took a while for that executive function to take back over. But in that middle ground, it was like every single day. It didn't matter what was on the line. It didn't matter like if it was going to kill me. It probably wouldn't have made a difference because I was not even like in a place where I felt like I understood that I was making a decision, and it would just happen. And I would look back on it and not even think twice. It was crazy. And so like I remember the fear because I became kind of lucid about it. And I realized as I kept going to this hospitalization place, Snickers, come on, you can't block the camera. So I was realizing that as I was going to this hospitalization place, that I didn't understand how I was even ending up there, and I had no idea how to stop. Like I really had no idea how to stop, and there's nothing they could do to help me. And they were like talking like, oh, just like change your behavior, do this. I mean, I tried so many things. I was staring at mandalas. I was doing yoga, and it was there was just like a lapse in my cognitive engagement. It was almost like the wheels were spinning, but parts of my brain weren't connecting. And so like the parts of my brain that are like the me that wants to like help other people and do the right thing, and that's such a terrible phrase. I shouldn't even say that. But to do my artwork, and I'm motivated by beauty and spending time with my friends. Like some of those things still were present, but it was always an afterthought to making sure I had everything a certain way, and part of that was making sure I always had IPAs and making sure I always had just different things, and so like there was definitely a bit of insanity there. So I could identify with like them saying there's something different in the brain that happens when somebody becomes alcoholic because my shit was not operating the way that my brain operates right now. Like not at all. I don't. It's like I find it hard to reconcile the person I am with the person who I was at that time. And the way that alcohol influences memory feeds into that because your memory is not in the same state that it's in when you're not drinking. It's different. Some people will call it drunk memory. You forget something until pick up a drink again, and then all of a sudden you remember, but you can't remember until you pick up a drink, right? So, like that's a real thing. Like I had to relearn how to play some of my instruments because I learned them all when I was fucked up, and it wasn't the same. It was different. Um, Sometimes it wasn't, but most of them were pretty different. Um, so so there's this phenomenon of craving. That's symptom one that we get out of this chapter. So for the allergic types with this phenomenon, there it says that we can't ever safely use alcohol in any form at all. And I think that if it's accurate, that it's genuinely an allergy. And this is definitely not the majority of people, right? So very very small minority of people who drink alcohol meet this definition, right? So people say, "Oh, there's low success rates." Well, no, we're actually only trying to help this specific kind of person because that's what this was for, not all those other people, right? So we shouldn't be sending all those other people to this, right? Because there's a strict definition. And people in public service, if they understood it better, then maybe they wouldn't make that recommendation. It's a bad recommendation. So they say that the people who are this type of person can't ever use alcohol safely in any form at all. And so once you form this particular habit and you realize that you cannot break it, the exact sentiments and experience that I conveyed to you from my own life story. I'm not gonna like debate my own lived experience, but that's what I personally identify with having experience. Um, so once having lost their self confidence, their reliance upon things human, their problems pile up on them and become astonishingly difficult to solve. And I can identify with that statement. Now, I can say that that's also been true after I stopped drinking, but honestly, things haven't been as hard. So that's not a lie either. So frothy emotional appeal seldom suffices. They're saying, this is an emotional matter. The message that that which can interest and hold these kinds of alcoholic people must have depth and weight. There's there's a reason why the program seems to have a particular insanity for people that don't happen to share this particular insanity. Not a surprise. The message which can interest. All right, so in nearly all cases, these ideals have to be grounded in some kind of power greater than a person's self if they are to recreate their lives. Um, that's debatable. I don't know why a doctor would talk about spirituality, but anyway. If any feel that as psychiatrists directing a hospital for alcoholics we appear somewhat sentimental, let them stand with us a while on the firing line and see the tragedies, the despairing wives, the little children. Let the solving of these problems become part of their daily work, and even of their sleeping moments, and the most cynical will not wonder that we have accepted and encouraged this movement. We feel after many years of experience that we have found nothing which has contributed. Let me get my tea. Still a little. Hold on one second. I'll have to I have to get my teeth. Oh. My nose is still healing, so I'm not in the best shape just yet. Oh, oh, that's like 10 times better. So, so he's inviting other people to join him in doing this work and experience the frustration. I get it. Like they were trying to figure some things out in a time where they had very limited access to information. They were willing to be adventurous and try different things. And I think this is where a lot of the dissenters kind of gain some of their purchase in their claims or criticisms of the AA and NA is exactly because of that. That this is something that is completely and utterly outdated. And people have been hesitant to revisit it because they don't want to take away or ruin something that's sustained literally millions of people who, in previous understanding, when this started, those people were essentially considered to be dead. So anything better than dead was better, and so they were willing to entertain doing something different, and it seemed to work, and it still does work for a specific group of people because there's still people that do it for whatever reason it works for them. Just the same as for some people just going to church. Some people just start recovery and decide to start abstaining, and they say, "Oh, I'm just gonna stop drinking and go to church," and that's what they do, right? So it's nothing really more radical than that. But that's why I feel like we dispel some of the fear when we just name what we're talking about and we expose people to what it is that people talk about, and there's really nothing, in my opinion, there's really nothing radical in this book. Like, there's definitely some misunderstandings for sure, and I think a lot of it's driven by people who wrote this had an incredible amount of internalized stigma, and they had just entered a prohibition era experience, and so there was a ton of stigma on people that used alcohol. They just exited prohibition, so like think about how stigmatized drug users are, and you want to ask them to write something to empower themselves, and then they wind up with something that has a whole bunch of stigma in it because internalized stigma. People have been internally stigmatized for almost a century now, and it sucks. Having to explain to other drug users why the words we're using are stigmatizing us, and people are using them to demonize us, and hopefully securing some sort of genocide because they can't stand us. They fucking hate drug users, right? And so, like, I'm not willing to fucking bandwagon on that shit. So, men and women drink essentially because they like the effect produced by alcohol. The sensation is so elusive that, while they admit it is injurious, they cannot after a time differentiate the true from the false. To them, their alcoholic life seems the only normal one. I think this ties into some suspicions around its impact on memory and perception. Memory and perception become distorted when they don't function properly. It's kind of common sense. They are restless, irritable, and discontented unless they can again experience the sense of ease and comfort which comes at once by taking a few drinks. I've definitely experienced the discomfort of not being drunk and then having a few drinks and feeling better. I think most people who've spent some time hanging out with college frat people have experienced that. I don't think that's a radical idea. succumb to the desire again, as so many do, and the phenomenon of craving develops. They pass through the well-known stages of a spree, emerging remorseful with a firm resolution not to drink again. This repeated over and over. Unless this person can experience an entire psychic change, there's very little hope of his recovery. So they're really laying out a very specific picture of a person with a very particularly bleak outset with alcohol. So on the other hand, and strange as this may seem to those who do not understand, once a psychic change has occurred, the very same person who seemed doomed, who had so many problems he despaired of ever solving them, suddenly finds himself easily able to control his desire for alcohol, the only effort necessary being that to require a few simple rules. Um, so that doesn't really sound too radical. Uh, I guess the concept of a psychic change. What is a psychic change? It's a very interesting question. How to bring about a psychic change, change in thinking, CBT. Yeah, we're going to get there. So men have cried out to me in sincere and despairing appeal. Doctor, I cannot go on like this. Everything to live for. I must stop, but I cannot. You must help me. Faced with this problem, if a doctor is honest with himself, he must sometimes feel his own inadequacy. Although he gives all that is in him, it is often not enough. So one feels that something more than human power is needed to produce the essential psychic change, or just an advancement in science. Um, Through the aggregate of recoveries resulting from a psychiatric effort is considerable, we physicians must admit that we have made little impression upon the problem as a whole. Many types do not respond to the ordinary psychological approach. I do not hold that those who believe that alcoholism is entirely a problem of mental control. I have had many men who had, for example, worked a period of months on some problem or business deal, which was to be settled on a certain date favorable to them, and they took a drink a day or so prior to the date, and then a phenomenon of craving occurred, and at once it became more important than everything else. So that important appointment was not met. These men were not drinking to escape; they were drinking to overcome a craving that was beyond their mental control. Um, there are many situations which arise out of the phenomenon of craving, which cause men to make the supreme sacrifice rather than continue to fight. Um, the classification of alcoholics seems to be most difficult and in much detail is outside the scope of this book. There are, of course, the psychopaths who are emotionally unstable and well recognized as present in all communities, including AA. So they're there, just like they're everywhere. We are all familiar with this type. They're always going on the wagon for keeps. They are over remorseful and make many resolutions but never a decision. There is the type of man who is unwilling to admit that he cannot take a drink. He plans various ways of drinking, changes his brand or his environment. There's the type who always believes that after being entirely free from alcohol for a period, that he can take a drink without danger. And that describes probably the majority of moderation-based recovery. So there's definitely that type of person, right? So they're all different people. There's a manic depressive type who is perhaps the least understood by his friends and about whom a whole chapter could probably be written. Then there are types of entirely normal in every aspect except in the effect alcohol has upon them. They are often able, intelligent, friendly people. All these and many others have one symptom in common. They cannot start drinking without developing the phenomenon of craving. This phenomenon is what sets apart an alcoholic from other drinkers. As we have suggested, may be the manifestation of analogy, which differentiates these people and sets them apart as a distinct group. Has never been, by any treatment with which we are familiar, permanently eradicated. So apparently it never goes away. I don't know if the current science agrees with that. We have medications that can help with that. But I don't know if it ever goes away. It's a good question. Maybe for some people it goes away and some people it doesn't. That's probably what I would expect. Um, it has never been by any treatment with which we are familiar permanently eradicated. So the only relief we have to suggest is entire abstinence. This immediately precipitates us into a seething cauldron of debate. Much has been written pro and con, but among physicians, the general opinion seems to be that most chronic alcoholics are doomed. So at the time this was written, this was a death sentence, essentially. They didn't feel that it was curable or treatable, which sucks. So the fact that there were hundreds of people emerging that survived, that's pretty awesome. So what is the solution? Perhaps I can best answer this by relating one of my experiences. About 1 year prior to this experience, a man was brought in to be treated for chronic alcoholism. He had partially recovered from a gastric hemorrhage and seemed to be a case of pathological mental deterioration. He had lost everything worthwhile in his life and was only living, one might say, to drink. He frankly admitted and believed that for him there was no hope. So this person had lost their hope. That's another common symptom of this particular condition. Following the elimination of alcohol, there was found to be no permanent brain injury. He accepted the plan outlined in the book. 1 year later, he called me and I experienced a very strange sensation. I knew the man by name and partly recognized his features, but from there all resemblance ended. From a trembling, despairing, nervous wreck had emerged a man brimming over with self-reliance and contentment. I talked with him for some time, but was not able to bring myself to feel that I had known him before. To me, he was a stranger, and so he left me. A long time had passed with no return to alcohol. When I need a mental uplift, I often think to another case brought in by a physician prominent in New York. Um, the patient had made his own diagnosis, which, by the way, he never mentions that this guy had ever done anything of the AA sort. Impressions given, but he never says it directly. Um, so just thinking about that objectively, that could have been something other than what some people might represent it to be. When I need a mental uplift, I think of another case brought in by a physician prominent in New York. The patient had made his own diagnosis and deciding his situation hopeless. So again, self-diagnosis. He had hidden in a deserted barn, determined to die. He was rescued by a searching party in a desperate condition brought to me. Following his physical rehabilitation, so they treated him physically first, he had a talk with me in which he frankly stated he thought the treatment a waste of effort unless I could assure him, which no one ever had, that in the future he would have the willpower to resist the impulse to drink. His alcoholic problem was so complex and his depression so great that we felt his only hope would be through what we then called moral psychology, and we doubted if even then that would have any effect. However, he did become sold on the ideas contained in this book, and he has not had a drink for a great many years. I see him now and then, and he is a fine specimen of manhood as one could ever wish to meet. I earnestly advise every alcoholic to read this book through, and for though perhaps he came to scoff, he may remain to pray. So that's the doctor's opinion. It's very simple. You know, the diagnosis is a change. You know, there's a physical change. There's a mental craving, um, and then this kind of behavior that just flies in the face of logical consequences. Somebody who can have a complete and utter disconnect, like almost like a blind spot that's unique to the consumption of alcohol. And the combination of these things makes it really difficult for a person to accept their experiences and to believe that they're unwell, period, even if things are really terrible around them. And even when they are able to, that the combination of these other things happening at the same time causes a particular person to not be able to um, handle stopping drinking. And I've experienced that. So look at that. We made it through the doctor's opinion. Nothing really radical, nothing really scary. I mean, there may be a few things in there that are, probably outdated. Our science has changed significantly. Our understanding of the human brain and our biology has changed significantly. But I have to say, for being 100 years ago, they really weren't super far off the mark. And I think as we start to unpack and look at like how the history and the pressures and the oppression and the misinformation campaigns and kind of the social expectations, how those all packed in into certain parts of the program that were developed by these people, you can see where it's present, this internalized stigma. And hopefully I'll be able to point some of that out to you folks. Of course, there is a strong language of spirituality in the program, and I try to diminish that a lot because I don't want it to be the focus of our assessment of this tool, um, because I think that there is a lot of good information in here. It's just maybe packed in with some things that need to be unpacked a little bit more, right? So I would encourage people to just think about it. Maybe we don't have to destroy things to make them better. We just make them better. So I'm not going to encourage people just yet to discard this belief system. I'm going to encourage people to have all different kinds of belief systems, and whatever that is, whatever works best for you. I hope you keep it, and I'll support it. It's okay if it's different. It's perfectly okay. So next week, I want to like kind of go over a topic and then get into some other stuff and then go back to a topic, and maybe we'll do something fun next week. I was having a jam session right before I joined all you guys, and I was working on trying to get my Mevo up and start doing this multi-platform stream. So thank you guys, for joining me again this week. I hope you guys have enjoyed this week's session. I hope you folks have learned a little something about what the alcoholism in this book is describing and what it's saying, and I want to just remind the professionals out there who might watch this, and people who are working and helping and supporting other people to find recoveries, that the book even acknowledges the importance of the medical community and of treatment, and it doesn't diminish the importance of that. It was simply meant as a supplement to for people to have something in the community to connect to have some identity, to be able to establish a tribal culture. It was really drawn on a lot of the work of the folks much earlier in our history on the Red Road, in our native indigenous history here on this continent, and what that's brought as far as healing into our communities. And these guys really tried to do the best they could to make it something that more people could access or understand, and to pack it into a different package. And part of that was embracing what would seem to be some very general Christian ideals. And that's fine. That's not everybody's belief system. And then you can see where they also threaded back and went to say, we included the chapter of the agnostic to try to welcome more people to this. But it was kind of reverse engineered. So it's definitely something worth thinking about in the way that the whole literature has evolved, to just really think about how that's been all packed together. And maybe we can think about doing another revision. I think that would probably be helpful. So hope you guys enjoyed this week, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Thanks.